"Get out of my house. You're not my daughter anymore." The words cut through the freezing Chicago night like a blade, leaving 23-year-old Emily shattered on the doorstep she had called home her entire life. "Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from or what time it is. Enjoy this story that might change how you see family forever." Emily Margaret Richardson stood on the familiar front porch of the two-story brick house on Maple Street, her duffel bag clutched in trembling hands, her 7-month pregnant belly straining against a coat that no longer fit. The porch light cast harsh shadows across her tear-streaked face, illuminating the disbelief in her brown eyes as she stared at the door that had just slammed shut behind her. The same door she had painted robin's egg blue with her father 3 summers ago, laughing as they got more paint on themselves than on the wood. The December wind whipped through the bare oak trees lining the street, carrying the scent of snow and the distant sound of families settling in for warm dinners. Christmas lights twinkled from neighboring houses, creating a mockery of joy that made Emily's exile feel even more devastating. She could hear the muffled sounds of her childhood home continuing without her, the television playing her father's evening news program, her mother's footsteps moving through the kitchen where Emily had learned to bake cookies and dream of her own family someday. Her hands, red and raw from the cold, fumbled with the zipper of her bag as she searched for her phone. The device felt foreign in her numb fingers as she scrolled through contacts, realizing with growing panic that she had nowhere to go. Her college friends had scattered after graduation, moving to different cities for jobs and relationships that didn't include a pregnant girl with no money and no prospects. Her part-time job at Morrison's bookstore paid barely enough for gas and groceries, let alone rent for an apartment she'd never thought she'd need. The baby moved inside her, a gentle flutter that reminded Emily she wasn't just responsible for herself anymore. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the solid reality of the life growing within her, a life that had transformed her from beloved daughter to unwanted burden in the span of a single conversation. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same man who had taught her to ride a bicycle and helped with her homework now viewed her as a moral failure too shameful to share his roof. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered to her unborn child, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "I'm so sorry this is how your story starts." Her phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. Maybe her mother had convinced her father to reconsider. Maybe Tyler, the baby's father, had changed his mind about wanting nothing to do with them. Maybe anyone remembered that she was still the same Emily, who volunteered at the animal shelter and brought soup to elderly neighbors when they were sick. But the message was from Tyler, and the words destroyed what little hope remained. "I can't do this. Don't contact me again. I'm sorry." Emily's legs gave out, and she sank onto the cold concrete steps, her back against the door that had once represented safety and unconditional love. The steps where her father had taken pictures on her first day of school, where her mother had bandaged scraped knees and promised that everything would be okay. Now those same steps felt like a throne of judgment, elevated above a world that had suddenly become hostile and unforgiving. The neighborhood around her hummed with the quiet contentment of middle-class stability. Garage doors opened and closed as people returned from work, their headlights sweeping across Emily's huddled form before disappearing into warm, well-lit homes. Dogs barked their evening greetings, and somewhere a child laughed, sounds that had once been the comforting soundtrack of her life, but now felt like reminders of everything she'd lost. She remembered the conversation that had led to this moment, replaying every devastating word. She'd come home from her doctor's appointment with ultrasound pictures in her purse, finally ready to tell her parents about the pregnancy she'd been hiding for months. The plan had been simple: show them the pictures, explain that while the timing wasn't ideal, she was committed to being a good mother, ask for their support while she figured out her next steps. Instead, her father's face had turned the color of aged brick, his voice rising to a volume she'd never heard directed at her before. "Who is he? Some loser you met at college? Does he even have a job?" "Tyler's studying business," she'd said, her voice small and defensive. "He's just scared. We both are. But I love him, and I thought—" "You thought wrong," her father had interrupted, his words precise and final. "You thought you could make irresponsible choices and have us clean up the mess. You thought you could embarrass this family and still live under my roof. You thought wrong about everything." Her mother had stood silent in the kitchen doorway, twisting her wedding ring around her finger, a nervous habit Emily recognized from childhood moments of family crisis. But this time, there had been no intervention, no gentle voice suggesting they all calm down and discuss things rationally. This time her mother's silence had been complicit in Emily's banishment. Now sitting alone on the steps with nowhere to go and no money for a hotel room, Emily understood that her childhood was officially over. The safety net she'd taken for granted, the assumption that no matter what happened, her family would help her through difficult times, had been yanked away with surgical precision. She was on her own in a way that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if responding to her mother's emotional turmoil. Emily closed her eyes and tried to imagine a future where this moment was just a difficult beginning rather than a tragic ending. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed 8 o'clock, marking the end of her first hour as a homeless, pregnant woman with nothing but determination and an unborn child who deserved better than the circumstances into which she was being born. 3 hours later, Emily found herself on a bench in Lincoln Park, her body curled protectively around her swollen belly as the December wind cut through her inadequate coat like frozen daggers. The park, that had once been her refuge during high school breakups and college stress, now felt like a wilderness where decent people didn't venture after dark. Streetlights created pools of yellow illumination that only emphasized the vast darkness between them, and every rustle of leaves made her heart race with fear of what might emerge from the shadows. Her fingers had gone numb inside her thin gloves, the same gloves her mother had given her last Christmas, back when Emily had been the promising college graduate with a bright future ahead of her. Now those gloves felt like relics from another life, inadequate protection against a world that had suddenly turned arctic and unwelcoming. She pulled her knees closer to her chest, trying to create a pocket of warmth for herself and the baby, whose movements had become more frequent as if responding to her stress. The bench was dedicated to someone's beloved grandmother, according to the small plaque she could barely read in the dim light. Margaret O'Brien, who found joy in simple things. Emily wondered if Margaret had ever spent a night homeless and pregnant, if she'd ever felt the particular desperation of having nowhere to go when your body was carrying another human being who depended entirely on your ability to survive. A police car cruised slowly through the park, its headlights sweeping across Emily's huddled form. She held her breath, uncertain whether law enforcement would offer help or simply move her along to become someone else's problem. The car paused, and she could see the officer's silhouette leaning forward to get a better look at her, but after what felt like an eternity, the vehicle continued its patrol, leaving Emily alone with her relief and her shame. She'd been the good daughter for 23 years, student council president in high school, dean's list in college, volunteer at the local literacy center where she taught adults to read. She'd never been arrested, never used drugs, never even gotten a speeding ticket. Her rebellion had consisted of staying out past curfew twice and dating a boy her parents didn't approve of during her sophomore year of high school. Yet here she was, cast out like a criminal because she'd fallen in love with someone who wasn't ready to be a father. The irony cut deep. For years her parents had lectured her about responsibility, about making smart choices, about the importance of family values. They'd raised her to believe that love and commitment were the foundations of a good life, that marriage and children were sacred institutions worthy of sacrifice and dedication. But when she'd needed those values most, when she'd needed love, commitment, and sacrifice from them, they'd abandoned their own principles faster than Tyler had abandoned her. Her phone battery was dying, the screen flickering between full brightness and dimness as the device struggled to maintain power. She'd tried calling her college roommate Sarah, but the number went straight to voicemail. She'd sent desperate texts to 3 different classmates, explaining her situation in increasingly pathetic terms, but the responses had been awkward variations of, "I wish I could help, but," followed by excuses about small apartments, strict landlords, and roommates who wouldn't approve of a pregnant woman disrupting their lives. The bookstore where she worked had been her sanctuary for 2 years, a place where she could lose herself among stories of people who overcame impossible odds and found happiness against all expectations. She'd arrived there straight from college, grateful for any job that allowed her to work around books while she figured out her long-term career plans. The pay was modest, but it had seemed adequate when she was living rent-free in her childhood bedroom, and her biggest expenses were gas and coffee. Now she calculated and recalculated the pathetic numbers in her checking account. $237. Not enough for a security deposit on an apartment, barely enough for a week in the cheapest motel she could find. Even if she worked every available shift at the bookstore, her income would never stretch to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and the medical expenses that came with pregnancy and childbirth. The baby's father had been her psychology classmate, charming and ambitious in the way that had made her believe their relationship was heading towards something permanent. Tyler had talked about their future together with such confidence, making plans for graduate school and careers that would complement each other perfectly. He'd been the one to suggest they stop using protection, saying he wanted to see what happens naturally between them. But when Emily had told him about the pregnancy, Tyler's romantic idealism had evaporated like morning frost. Suddenly he was too young for such responsibilities, too focused on his career goals to be tied down by a family. The baby would ruin his plans, he'd said, his voice clinical and detached, as if they were discussing a failed experiment rather than the child they'd created together. He'd offered to pay for an abortion, pressing $500 into her hands like he was purchasing her compliance with his preferred solution. Emily had returned the money, telling him she couldn't terminate the pregnancy. She'd expected anger, disappointment, maybe even relief that she was taking responsibility for the decision. Instead, Tyler had looked at her with something approaching disgust, as if her choice to continue the pregnancy was a personal attack on his freedom and future prospects. "I never said I wanted kids," he'd told her, his words carefully chosen to minimize his own responsibility. "You're the one making this choice. Don't expect me to pay for it for the next 18 years. Now, shivering on a park bench with her possessions condensed into a single duffel bag, Emily understood that she'd been living in a fantasy. The loving family, the supportive boyfriend, the stable future she'd imagined for herself and her child, all of it had been built on foundations that crumbled the moment they were tested by real difficulty. A group of teenagers walked through the park, their laughter echoing off the bare trees as they headed home from whatever Friday night activities occupied people whose biggest problems were homework assignments and weekend plans. Emily watched them pass, remembering when her own concerns had been so manageable, so easily solved with good intentions and hard work. She envied their assumption that the world was fundamentally fair, that good people were rewarded and bad people were punished, that families protected their own no matter what challenges arose. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the pavement with a sound like tiny bones rattling. Emily pulled her coat tighter around her belly, whispering apologies to the child who would be born into such uncertain circumstances. She'd wanted to give her baby everything: stability, love, a family that celebrated new life instead of treating it as a burden to be discarded. Instead, her child's first home would be a park bench in Chicago, and her first lullabies would be the sound of traffic and wind through bare branches. Dawn came grey and merciless, finding Emily still curled on the park bench with frost in her hair and her coat damp from the night's moisture. Every joint in her body screamed in protest as she tried to straighten up, her pregnant belly making even simple movements feel like monumental efforts. The morning joggers were beginning their routines, their breath forming white clouds as they passed her with carefully averted eyes, maintaining the social fiction that homeless people were invisible unless they became threatening or demanding. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a hollow ache that seemed to echo through her entire body. The last meal she'd eaten had been lunch yesterday at the bookstore, a peanut butter sandwich and an apple that now felt like a feast compared to the emptiness gnawing at her insides. She stood slowly, testing her ability to walk without collapsing, and made her way toward the public restrooms near the park's entrance. The facilities were cold and unwelcoming, designed more for deterrence than comfort, but they offered running water and privacy. Emily stared at herself in the cracked mirror above the sink, barely recognizing the hollow-eyed woman looking back at her. Her normally neat brown hair hung limp and tangled. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of exhaustion and malnutrition, and her clothes carried the unmistakable stigma of having been slept in. She splashed cold water on her face and tried to finger-comb her hair into something approaching respectability. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing her mother's distress and responding with its own agitation. Emily pressed her hand to her belly and whispered reassurances she didn't believe herself. "It's going to be okay, little one. Mommy's going to figure this out." But figuring it out seemed impossible when every option required resources she didn't possess. Homeless shelters had waiting lists and strict requirements about sobriety and mental health that Emily wasn't sure she could meet in her current emotional state. Government assistance programs required permanent addresses and documentation she'd left behind in her hasty departure from home. Even the most basic necessities, food, shelter, medical care, felt impossibly out of reach. She walked through downtown Chicago, her duffel bag growing heavier with each block as she searched for somewhere to spend the day without drawing unwanted attention. The morning rush hour swirled around her with purposeful energy, professionals in tailored coats hurrying toward office buildings and coffee shops, their lives organized around schedules and obligations that seemed luxurious in their predictability. At a corner coffee shop, she stood outside the window watching people order elaborate drinks that cost more than she had to spend on food for the entire day. A woman about her age sat by the window, typing on a laptop while sipping a complicated beverage topped with whipped cream and cinnamon. She wore the kind of soft sweater that Emily had taken for granted when she lived at home, her hair professionally styled and her makeup carefully applied for whatever important work awaited her attention. The contrast was devastating. 24 hours ago, Emily could have been that woman, clean, purposeful, secure in the assumption that her next meal and her next night's sleep were guaranteed. Now she pressed her face against the cold glass like a child outside a toy store, desperate for warmth and sustenance she couldn't afford. When a security guard emerged from the coffee shop and approached her with the wary expression reserved for people who looked like they might cause problems, Emily quickly moved on. She understood that her appearance now marked her as undesirable, someone whose presence might make paying customers uncomfortable. The same face that had been welcomed everywhere just days ago was now a liability, evidence of failure that others preferred not to acknowledge. She found temporary refuge in the public library, where homeless people were tolerated as long as they remained quiet and didn't sleep in the chairs. The building was warm and offered free Wi-Fi, allowing Emily to search desperately for resources that might help a pregnant woman in her situation. But every program seemed designed for people whose circumstances were more stable than hers, requiring proof of income or housing that she couldn't provide. The job listings were equally discouraging. Entry-level positions that might have seemed acceptable when she had family support now appeared impossible when she calculated the timeline between application, interview, and first paycheck. Even if she found employment immediately, she'd need weeks or months to accumulate enough money for housing deposits and basic necessities. The baby wasn't going to wait for her to achieve financial stability. Her phone rang, and hope surged through her chest until she saw her mother's name on the screen. For a moment, she imagined that her parents had reconsidered, that a night to think things over had reminded them of their love for their daughter and their responsibility to help her through this crisis. Emily, her mother's voice was careful, controlled in the way that meant she'd rehearsed this conversation. "Where are you?" "I'm at the library," Emily said, trying to keep her own voice steady. "Mum, please, I know Dad is angry, but can't we—" "He's not just angry, Emily. He's hurt. We both are." Her mother paused, and Emily could hear the familiar sounds of home in the background, the coffee maker brewing, the morning news playing quietly on the kitchen television. "You've embarrassed this family. Our friends, our neighbors, our church. Everyone knows now. How are we supposed to face people?" The words hit Emily like physical blows. Even in her desperation, she'd held on to the belief that her parents' reaction was motivated by concern for her welfare, misguided but ultimately rooted in love. To discover that their primary worry was social embarrassment rather than her safety felt like a betrayal deeper than the original rejection. "I'm homeless, Mom," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "I slept on a park bench last night. I don't have any money or anywhere to go. I'm pregnant and scared and I need help." "You should have thought about that before you made your choices," her mother replied, the practiced response of someone who'd convinced herself that cruelty was actually a form of tough love. "Maybe this will teach you something about responsibility." "Responsibility?" Emily's voice rose, drawing sharp looks from other library patrons. "I'm taking responsibility. I'm keeping the baby, even though it would be easier not to. I'm trying to figure out how to be a good mother with no support from anyone. How is that not responsible?" "Don't raise your voice at me, young lady. Your father and I raised you better than this. You raised me to believe that family stands by each other," Emily shot back, her careful composure finally cracking. "You raised me to think that parents protect their children no matter what happens. You raised me to be disappointed in the people I trusted most." The line went quiet for a long moment, and Emily thought her mother might finally acknowledge the cruelty of their position. Instead, when she spoke again, her voice was colder than ever. "When you're ready to apologize and make some real changes in your life, you can call us. Until then, you're on your own." The call ended, leaving Emily staring at her phone in the stunned silence that follows a devastating blow. The small hope she'd maintained that her family might come to their senses died completely, replaced by the terrible clarity that she truly was alone in the world. Her parents' love, which she'd believed was unconditional, had apparently come with terms and conditions she'd never been informed about. An elderly librarian approached her table, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that suggested she'd witnessed this scene before. "Are you all right, dear?" Emily looked up, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak. The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a tissue, offering it with the kind of simple human kindness that felt revolutionary after the coldness Emily had experienced from her own family. "There's a community center about 6 blocks from here," the librarian said quietly. "They serve lunch to anyone who needs it, no questions asked. The food is good, and the people are kind. Sometimes that's what we need most when the world feels impossible." Emily took the tissue and managed to whisper her thanks. In that moment, a stranger's compassion felt more valuable than all the conditional love she'd lost, offering the first glimmer of hope that perhaps there were still people in the world who understood that dignity and kindness shouldn't depend on perfect circumstances or flawless choices. The community center sat on a corner where hope and desperation intersected, its weathered brick facade bearing hand-painted signs advertising free meals, job training, and emergency assistance. Emily approached the building with the careful uncertainty of someone who'd never needed charity before, her middle-class upbringing having taught her to view such places with a mixture of pity and fear. Now she understood that these institutions weren't symbols of failure, but lifelines for people whose circumstances had spiraled beyond their control. Inside, the smell of home-cooked food, chicken soup and fresh bread, made her stomach clench with desperate hunger. The dining area was filled with people whose stories were written in their faces. Elderly men who might once have been executives or laborers, now united in their need for a warm meal. Women with children clinging to their sides, their eyes holding the same desperate calculation Emily recognized in herself. Teenagers who looked too young to be on their own, but too old to be turned away. A volunteer with graying hair and paint-stained apron approached Emily with the gentle efficiency of someone who'd learned to read the signs of first-time visitors. "Welcome, honey. I'm Margaret. Have you been here before?" Emily shook her head, suddenly embarrassed by her own need. "The librarian told me you serve lunch. I don't have any money, but I'm pregnant and I haven't eaten since yesterday, and—" "You don't need to explain anything," Margaret interrupted kindly, guiding Emily toward a table near the window. "Everyone here has a story, and everyone deserves to eat. That's the only qualification we require." The soup arrived in a generous bowl, accompanied by thick slices of homemade bread that looked like it had been baked by someone who understood that food was love made tangible. Emily ate slowly, savoring each spoonful while trying not to appear desperate, despite feeling like she might faint from hunger. The warmth spread through her body, and she felt the baby respond with gentle movements that seemed like gratitude. At the next table, a woman about her mother's age sat with 2 young children, carefully dividing a single meal between 3 people while maintaining a cheerful demeanor that couldn't quite hide the worry in her eyes. Emily watched her tear her bread into precise pieces, giving the larger portions to her children, while pretending she wasn't hungry herself, a sacrifice so profound yet so quietly performed that it brought tears to Emily's eyes. "First time?" asked a man across from her, his voice rough but not unkind. He appeared to be in his 60s, wearing clothes that had once been expensive, but now showed the wear of extended use. "I can tell by the way you're looking around. Like you're not sure you belong here." Emily nodded, not trusting her voice. "None of us expected to end up here," he continued, stirring his soup with the methodical patience of someone who'd learned to make meals last as long as possible. "I used to manage a department store, had a house, 2 cars, retirement savings. Then the company downsized, my wife got sick, medical bills ate everything we'd saved, and here I am. Life doesn't ask permission before it changes everything." His words carried no self-pity, just the weary acceptance of someone who'd learned that circumstances could shift faster than preparation could prevent. Emily found comfort in his matter-of-fact acknowledgement that good people could find themselves in impossible situations through no fault of their own. After lunch, Margaret approached Emily again, this time carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who'd learned to offer practical help alongside emotional support. "We have some resources that might help you. emergency housing assistance, job placement services, medical care for pregnant women. Nothing that solves everything overnight, but steps in the right direction. Emily followed Margaret to a small office filled with filing cabinets and motivational posters that managed to seem encouraging rather than patronizing. The older woman pulled out forms and pamphlets, explaining programs with the expertise of someone who'd helped countless people navigate systems designed more for bureaucratic efficiency than human need. The emergency housing has a waiting list, Margaret explained, her honesty as refreshing as it was discouraging. Could be 2 weeks, could be 6, depending on availability, but there's a temporary shelter program specifically for pregnant women that might have space tonight. It's not luxurious, but it's safe and warm. Emily filled out forms with hands that shook from exhaustion and emotion, providing information about her situation while trying to maintain some dignity in the face of questions that reduced her life to categories and checkboxes. Previous address, her parents' home, which she couldn't use anymore. Emergency contact, blank, because everyone she'd trusted had abandoned her. Employment status, part-time retail, insufficient for independent living. There's also a mentorship program, Margaret continued, setting aside the completed paperwork. Women who've been through similar experiences and found their way to stability. Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who understands what you're going through, not just professionally but personally. The idea of talking to someone who'd survived what Emily was currently enduring felt like the first real hope she'd encountered. She'd been drowning in isolation, convinced that her situation was uniquely shameful and impossible to overcome. The possibility that others had navigated similar challenges and emerged stronger offered a lifeline she desperately needed. As afternoon faded into evening, Emily found herself in the temporary shelter, a converted church basement with rows of cots separated by hanging sheets that provided minimal privacy but maximum safety. The other women were quiet, respectful of each other's need for rest and space. United by circumstances none of them would have chosen, but all of them were determined to survive. Emily lay on her narrow cot, one hand resting on her belly as the baby shifted and turned inside her. For the first time in days, she wasn't cold, wasn't hungry, wasn't terrified about where she'd sleep or whether she'd be safe until morning. The simple security of 4 walls and a roof felt like luxury after her night in the park. But even as her body began to relax, her mind remained troubled by the conversation with her mother and the cruel clarity of her abandonment. She'd been raised to believe that family was sacred, that parents loved their children unconditionally, that home was a place you could always return to when the world became too difficult to face alone. The destruction of those beliefs left her feeling unmoored, uncertain about everything she'd once taken for granted. Yet surrounded by other women who'd also lost their safety nets and found the strength to continue, Emily began to understand that survival was possible even when the people who were supposed to protect you chose judgment over love. The baby inside her deserved a mother who could model resilience, who could demonstrate that dignity wasn't dependent on other people's approval or support. As sleep finally came, Emily whispered promises to her unborn child, promises about love that wouldn't be conditional, about family that would be chosen rather than biological, about a future built on kindness rather than expectation. She didn't know how she'd keep those promises, but she knew with absolute certainty that she would find a way. The baby kicked gently, as if sealing their pact, and Emily smiled for the first time since leaving her parents' home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were safe, fed, and no longer alone in the world. 2 weeks into her new reality, as Emily sat in the shelter's common area, trying to stretch a $1 menu burger into 2 meals, her fragile world collapsed again. The caseworker approached with the apologetic expression Emily had learned to dread, carrying papers that would reshape her understanding of just how alone she truly was. "I'm sorry, Emily," said Ms. Rodriguez, settling into the plastic chair across from her. "We need to talk about your situation. The temporary shelter program has a 30-day limit, and you've been here 14 days. We need to start preparing for your transition to other arrangements." Emily's stomach dropped, the taste of processed meat turning to ash in her mouth. "Other arrangements? What does that mean?" "There are long-term facilities, but they have different requirements and restrictions. Some don't allow overnight stays if you're employed even part-time. Others require participation in programs that might conflict with your work schedule. And honestly, Ms. Rodriguez paused, consulting her clipboard with the reluctance of someone delivering bad news she couldn't soften. The waiting lists are extensive. 3 to 6 months minimum. 3 to 6 months. Emily calculated frantically. Her baby was due in 12 weeks, which meant she could be 8 months pregnant and still homeless when labor began. The image of giving birth in a park or a hospital emergency room with nowhere to take her newborn afterward made her physically ill. "There has to be something," Emily whispered, one hand instinctively moving to her belly where the baby had been increasingly active, as if sensing her mother's distress. "I'm working. I'm following all the rules. I'm trying to do everything right." "I know you are," Ms. Rodriguez said, her professional compassion worn thin by a system that demanded she manage impossible caseloads with insufficient resources. "But the reality is that single pregnant women without family support represent one of the most vulnerable populations and the most difficult to place in stable housing. Landlords see liability. Employers see potential complications. Even well-meaning people see problems they're not equipped to handle." Emily stared at the woman who'd just articulated what she'd been slowly learning through painful experience, that society's safety net had holes large enough for people like her to fall through completely. The system was designed to help people who needed temporary assistance while transitioning between stable situations, not people whose entire support structure had vanished overnight. "What am I supposed to do?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. "Where am I supposed to go with my baby?" Ms. Rodriguez shuffled through her papers, looking for alternatives that clearly didn't exist. "There are some faith-based organizations that sometimes offer longer-term assistance. The requirements can be more restrictive, but they might have space. And there's always the possibility that your family situation might change." "My family threw me away like garbage," Emily said, the words carrying the bitter weight of complete abandonment. "They care more about what their neighbors think than whether their daughter and grandchild live or die on the streets." That afternoon, Emily found herself standing outside her parents' house again, not because she believed they'd changed their minds, but because desperation had made her willing to endure any humiliation if it meant safety for her baby. The Christmas decorations were still up. The same wreath her mother hung every December, the same lights her father strung along the gutters with meticulous precision. The house looked exactly as it had when she'd belonged there, as if her exile had changed nothing about the lives continuing inside. She knocked on the door she'd once entered freely, her hand shaking as she waited for one of the people who'd created her to acknowledge her existence. When her mother answered, Emily saw her own features reflected in an older face that had hardened with disappointment and social embarrassment. Emily. The single word carried no warmth, no invitation, no suggestion that her daughter's presence was welcome. "Mom, please," Emily began, her prepared speech dissolving under the weight of her desperation. "I know you're angry, but I'm running out of places to go. The shelter can only keep me for 2 more weeks, and after that, I don't know what's going to happen to the baby." Her mother's face remained impassive, as if Emily were a stranger requesting directions rather than her own daughter begging for help. "Your father and I discussed this. We've made our position clear. You made your choice and now you have to live with the consequences." "The consequences?" Emily's voice rose despite her intention to remain calm. "You mean the consequence of falling in love with someone who turned out to be unreliable? The consequence of refusing to terminate a pregnancy because I believe this baby deserves to live? Those are the choices you're punishing me for." "You're not being punished," her mother replied with the practiced calm of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "You're experiencing the natural results of irresponsible decisions. Maybe if you'd thought about these consequences before you—" "Before I what?" Emily interrupted, her composure finally cracking under the weight of weeks of suppressed anger. "Before I trusted someone I loved? Before I believed the values you taught me about family and commitment? Before I assumed that my own parents would show me the same unconditional love they preached about for 23 years. Her mother stepped back slightly, as if Emily's pain were contagious, something that might infect her carefully constructed life if she got too close. "Lower your voice. The neighbors will hear." "The neighbors," Emily repeated, understanding flooding through her with devastating clarity. "That's what this is really about. Not my welfare or the baby's safety, or anything resembling parental love. It's about maintaining your reputation in a community that apparently matters more to you than your own child." In that moment, staring at the woman who'd given birth to her, but had chosen social standing over maternal instinct, Emily felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not heartbreak. She'd already endured that. This was different. This was the complete severing of hope, the final acknowledgement that the people she'd trusted most in the world had revealed themselves to be strangers wearing familiar faces. "You're right," Emily said quietly, stepping back from the doorway that would never welcome her again. "I did make a choice. I chose to love my baby more than I fear what people think. I chose to take responsibility for my life instead of hiding behind judgments about other people's mistakes. I chose to become the kind of person who helps rather than abandons people in crisis." She turned away from her childhood home for what she knew would be the last time, carrying the weight of absolute rejection, but also, surprisingly, a strange sense of liberation. She no longer had to hope for rescue from people who'd proven themselves incapable of love when it was most needed. She no longer had to measure herself against standards set by people who'd abandoned their own principles when tested by real difficulty. Walking away from that house, Emily felt her baby move inside her, strong, determined kicks that seemed to echo her own newfound resolve. They would survive this together, without the conditional love that had proven so fragile when faced with imperfect circumstances. They would build something better than what she'd lost, because they had no choice but to try. The rain began as Emily walked away from her parents' house, each drop feeling like another small punishment from a universe that seemed determined to test every limit of her endurance. By the time she reached the bus stop 3 blocks away, her thin coat was soaked through and her teeth were chattering uncontrollably. The baby moved restlessly inside her, responding to her mother's stress with increasingly urgent kicks that felt like protests against the cold and uncertainty that had become their constant companions. She stood under the inadequate shelter of the bus stop, watching her childhood neighborhood through the gray curtain of rain. Each house represented the kind of stability she'd once taken for granted: warm lights in windows, cars in driveways, families gathering for dinner while the weather raged outside. The contrast between their security and her homelessness felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. When the bus finally arrived, Emily climbed aboard with the few damp bills she had left, finding a seat in the back where she could cry without drawing attention from the other passengers. The city passed by in a blur of rain-streaked windows and glowing streetlights, and she realized she had nowhere specific to go. The shelter wouldn't open its doors for another 3 hours, and she couldn't afford to sit in a restaurant or coffee shop nursing a single purchase until evening. That's when she noticed him, a man in a dark coat sitting several rows ahead, who'd been glancing back at her with an expression that might have been concern or calculation. Emily had learned to be wary of men who showed too much interest in pregnant women alone, understanding that vulnerability could attract both genuine helpers and predators looking for easy targets. But when the bus reached downtown and she prepared to get off, the man approached her with the careful manner of someone who understood that his attention might be unwelcome. He was perhaps 40, with graying temples and kind eyes that held the particular compassion of someone who'd witnessed genuine suffering. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of rain hammering the bus roof. "I don't mean to intrude, but I couldn't help noticing that you seem to be having a difficult time. Are you all right?" Emily's first instinct was to lie, to maintain the pretense that everything was fine and she was simply a pregnant woman running errands in the rain. But something in his tone, genuine concern without judgment, made her pause. She was so tired of pretending, so exhausted by the constant effort of appearing normal when her life had become anything but normal. She began, then stopped, unsure how to explain her situation to a stranger without sounding pathetic or dangerous. "I'm having some housing issues." Michael introduced himself with the gentle courtesy of someone who understood that personal information was a privilege that had to be earned. He explained that he worked in real estate development, that he'd noticed her at the bus stop several times over the past week, always looking lost and carrying the same worn duffel bag that suggested someone without a permanent address. "I have a guest house," he said, his words careful and measured. "It's small, but it's clean and safe. You could stay there temporarily, just until you get back on your feet. I'd ask for some help, maintaining the property in exchange. Nothing strenuous, just basic upkeep that you could manage in your condition." Emily stared at him, her mind racing between desperate hope and learned caution. She'd heard too many stories about women in vulnerable situations being taken advantage of by men who offered help with strings attached. But she'd also learned that sometimes genuine kindness existed, that occasionally people helped without expecting anything beyond basic human decency in return. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why would you help someone you don't know?" Michael was quiet for a moment, looking out at the rain with an expression that suggested he was remembering something painful. "My sister was in a similar situation about 10 years ago. Pregnant, alone, cast out by family who thought their reputation mattered more than her welfare. She didn't make it through. Died in a car accident while living out of her vehicle, probably because she was too exhausted to drive safely." His honesty was devastating in its simplicity, and Emily felt tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. Here was someone who understood not just the practical challenges of her situation, but the emotional devastation of being abandoned by people who were supposed to love unconditionally. "I can't pay rent," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I barely have enough money for food." "I'm not asking for rent," Michael replied. "I'm asking for someone to care about the property the way someone who lived there would care about it. Someone to notice if something needs repair, to keep the space clean and welcoming, to treat it like home instead of just temporary shelter." The guest house sat behind a modest but well-maintained colonial in a quiet neighborhood where children's bicycles lay scattered on front lawns, and elderly couples walked small dogs in the early evening light. It was a tiny structure, barely 500 square feet, but it had everything Emily needed: a small kitchen, a bathroom with a shower that produced actual hot water, and a bedroom with a real bed that didn't require sharing space with strangers. Michael showed her around with the practical efficiency of someone who'd prepared the space specifically for someone in her circumstances. The refrigerator was stocked with basic groceries. The closet contained a few pieces of maternity clothing in her approximate size, and the bathroom medicine cabinet held prenatal vitamins and other supplies that suggested he'd done research about what pregnant women needed. "The previous tenant left some things," he explained when Emily stared at the clothes with disbelief. "I thought they might be useful." But Emily recognized new tags on some of the items, understood that Michael had purchased these things specifically for her situation. The kindness was overwhelming, so different from the conditional love and strategic charity she'd encountered from people who knew her that she wasn't sure how to respond. That first night in the guest house, Emily sat in the small kitchen eating a simple dinner she'd prepared on a functioning stove, her baby moving peacefully inside her, as if sensing the change in their circumstances. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't cold, wasn't hungry, wasn't terrified about where she'd sleep or whether she'd be safe until morning, but more than the physical comfort, she was overwhelmed by the experience of being treated with dignity by someone who owed her nothing. Michael hadn't lectured her about responsibility or moral choices. He hadn't demanded explanations about how she'd ended up in her situation or imposed conditions that would have made her feel like a charity case earning temporary reprieve through good behavior. He'd simply recognized another human being in crisis and responded with the kind of practical compassion that made survival possible without sacrificing self-respect. In a world that had taught her to expect judgment and abandonment, his simple kindness felt revolutionary. As she prepared for bed in clean sheets that smelled of lavender detergent, Emily found herself whispering promises to her baby about the kind of world they would try to create together, a world where love wasn't conditional on perfect circumstances, where help was offered without shame, where family was defined by choice and commitment rather than biology and obligation. She didn't know then that her circumstances were about to change in ways she couldn't imagine, that help was coming from sources she'd never considered. She only knew that for tonight, she and her baby were safe, warm, and no longer alone in a universe that had seemed determined to destroy them. Outside her window, the rain had stopped, and through the cleared glass, she could see stars beginning to appear between the breaking clouds. 2 weeks after settling into Michael's guest house, Emily had established a routine that felt like the beginning of a real life rather than mere survival. She woke each morning to sunlight streaming through clean windows, prepared breakfast in a kitchen that belonged to no one, but felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived since leaving her parents' house. The baby had grown calmer too, its movements less frantic and more rhythmic, as if responding to its mother's improved emotional state. She was organizing the small linen closet, part of her informal agreement to maintain the property, when she heard the mail truck rumble down the quiet street. Michael had mentioned that she might receive correspondence at this address, since she'd listed it as her temporary residence for various assistance programs and job applications. Most days brought nothing but promotional flyers and catalogs addressed to previous tenants, but today felt different somehow. Emily walked to the mailbox with the unhurried pace of someone who'd learned not to expect good news, her 8-month pregnant belly making even simple tasks require careful planning. The Chicago winter had given way to an early spring that painted the neighborhood in tentative greens, and the kind of soft light that made ordinary houses look like illustrations from children's books about families who never faced real hardship. Among the usual collection of junk mail was a formal envelope addressed to Emily Margaret Richardson, in the precise typography of legal correspondence. The return address belonged to a law firm she'd never heard of, Whitman, Burke and Associates, Estate Planning and Probate Services. Emily stared at the envelope for several minutes, unable to imagine why lawyers would be contacting her. Her only interaction with the legal system had been filling out paperwork for government assistance programs, and those communications came from social services departments, not private law firms. Inside the guest house, she set the envelope on the small kitchen table and stared at it while preparing tea, as if the hot beverage might provide courage for whatever unpleasant surprise awaited her attention. Perhaps Tyler had decided to pursue some legal action regarding the baby, though he'd made it clear he wanted no involvement in their lives. Maybe her parents had found some way to legally distance themselves from any responsibility for their grandchild's welfare. When she finally opened the envelope, her hands were shaking not from cold, but from the anticipation of another blow in a life that had already delivered more than she'd thought possible to endure. But the letter's contents were so unexpected, so impossible to comprehend, that she read the first paragraph 3 times before her mind could process what the carefully worded legal language was actually communicating. "Dear Ms. Richardson," the letter began in the formal tone of business correspondence that transformed human emotions into manageable administrative tasks. "We are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary in the last will and testament of Margaret Elizabeth O'Brien, who passed away on January 15th of this year. As her legal representatives, we need to arrange a meeting to discuss the details of your inheritance and complete the necessary documentation for transferring assets to your ownership." Emily's first thought was that there had been some mistake, that someone with a similar name had been confused with her in whatever database law firms used to track beneficiaries and inheritance claims. She'd never known anyone named Margaret O'Brien, certainly no one wealthy enough to leave behind assets requiring legal management and formal inheritance procedures. But as she continued reading, details emerged that made the connection impossible to deny. Margaret Elizabeth O'Brien had been her grandmother, her mother's mother, from whom the family had been estranged for over 15 years, following a bitter argument about money, religion, and the proper way to raise children that had resulted in complete communication breakdown between mother and daughter. Emily remembered fragments of conversations from her childhood, hushed arguments between her parents about Margaret's stubbornness and her mother's tearful insistence that some people can't be reasoned with. She'd been told that her grandmother was difficult, judgmental, impossible to please, someone whose absence from their lives was actually a blessing in disguise because it prevented ongoing conflict and disappointment. Now staring at legal documents that described substantial assets being transferred to her ownership, Emily began to understand that perhaps those childhood explanations had been incomplete. Perhaps her grandmother's difficulty had been opposition to choices her daughter made, disagreements about values and priorities that went deeper than simple personality conflicts. The inheritance included a house in Lincoln Park, investment accounts, savings bonds, and various financial instruments that the letter listed with clinical precision, but without indicating their total value. A handwritten note was attached to the legal documents, obviously added by one of the attorneys as clarification rather than formal part of the probate process. "Ms. O'Brien left specific instructions that you were to be contacted directly, rather than through your mother, as she was aware of family estrangement and wanted to ensure her intentions were honored, regardless of current family relationships. She left a personal letter for you that can be collected when you come to our office to complete the inheritance paperwork." Emily sat in the afternoon sunshine, filtering through her temporary home's windows, one hand resting on her belly where the baby was performing what felt like victory laps, and tried to comprehend that her circumstances had just changed in ways that made every struggle of the past month seem like preparation for this moment, rather than punishment for her choices. She wasn't just pregnant and homeless anymore. She wasn't just a woman whose family had abandoned her and whose child's father had rejected responsibility for the life they'd created together. She was the sole heir to someone who'd cared enough about her welfare to ensure that money would be available when she needed it most, even though they'd never had the opportunity to build a relationship during the grandmother's lifetime. 3 days later, Emily sat in the law office of Whitman, Burke & Associates, wearing the nicest outfit she'd been able to assemble from thrift store purchases and clothes Michael had provided. The building was elegant in the understated way of old money, with Persian rugs and oil paintings that suggested the kind of family wealth that passed from generation to generation through careful planning and conservative investment strategies. The senior partner, Mr. Ray Whitman, was a distinguished man in his 70s who handled her case with the gentle courtesy of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate the complex emotions that surrounded inheritance and family legacy. He explained the details of her grandmother's estate with patient thoroughness, ensuring she understood each component of what she was inheriting. The house in Lincoln Park was worth approximately $800,000, fully paid and maintained through a property management company that had been handling upkeep during the grandmother's final years in assisted living. The investment portfolio totaled another $200,000, diversified across stocks, bonds, and mutual funds that had been generating steady income for over 2 decades. Additional savings accounts, insurance policies, and personal property brought the total inheritance to $240,000. Emily stared at the numbers written in careful handwriting across multiple pages of legal documents, each figure representing security beyond anything she'd imagined possible for someone in her circumstances. The amount was so large that it felt abstract, like play money from a board game rather than actual resources she could use to build a stable life for herself and her baby. "Your grandmother left this for you as well," Mr. Whitman said, handing her a sealed envelope with her name written in the shaky handwriting of someone whose arthritis made writing difficult, but who'd been determined to communicate something important. "She wrote it about 6 months before her death, when she learned about your situation through unofficial channels." Emily opened the envelope with trembling fingers, unfolding pages of lined paper covered in the same careful handwriting that had addressed the envelope. The letter was dated just 3 months ago, which meant her grandmother had known about the pregnancy, the family rejection, and Emily's circumstances when she'd made final decisions about her estate distribution. "My dearest Emily," the letter began, "I know we never had the chance to know each other properly, thanks to your mother's stubborn pride and my own inability to apologize for mistakes I made when she was young. But I've been watching your life from a distance, and I want you to know that when I learned about your current difficulties, my heart broke for the ways our family has failed you. You are stronger than your mother ever was, braver than I was at your age, and determined to love your child unconditionally in ways that our family has forgotten how to practice. This money isn't charity. It's an investment in the kind of woman who chooses love over fear, who protects the vulnerable instead of abandoning them, who builds rather than destroys the connections that make life worth living. Use it to create the family you deserve, to build the life you've dreamed of, and to show your child that sometimes love comes from unexpected places when the people who should provide it prove inadequate to the task." Emily finished reading with tears streaming down her face, her baby moving actively inside her, as if celebrating alongside its mother. In the space of a single letter, she'd gained not just financial security, but the knowledge that someone in her family had valued her worth, had recognized her strength, and had taken action to ensure her future was protected, even when other family members chose abandonment over support. 4 months after discovering her inheritance, Emily stood in the nursery of her grandmother's Lincoln Park house, holding her 3-week-old daughter, Grace Margaret Richardson, named for the woman whose love had reached across years of family estrangement to provide security when it was needed most. The room was painted a soft yellow that caught the morning light streaming through windows that overlooked a garden where cherry trees were beginning to bloom with the promise of spring. Emily had used the inheritance wisely, not lavishly. She'd renovated the house with practical improvements rather than expensive luxuries, creating a home that felt warm and welcoming rather than intimidating. She'd established college funds and investment accounts that would ensure Grace's future education and security. Most importantly, she'd used her resources to help other women in situations similar to what she'd experienced, quietly funding programs at the community center where she'd first found refuge. The birth had been beautiful and terrifying, made more meaningful by the presence of people who'd chosen to be family, rather than those connected by biology. Michael had driven her to the hospital when contractions began, staying in the waiting room with flowers and nervous encouragement. Margaret from the community centre had visited daily, bringing meals and wisdom from her own experience as a single mother. Janet from the bookstore had sent a card with a photo of the store's new Emily's Corner, a reading area for pregnant women and new mothers who needed a quiet place to rest while browsing. Her parents knew nothing about Grace's birth. Emily had considered sending them an announcement, perhaps a photo with a note explaining that they had a granddaughter whose existence they might want to acknowledge. But each time she'd started to write such a message, she'd looked at her daughter's peaceful face and realized that some people didn't deserve access to such pure innocence. Grace would grow up knowing she was wanted, planned for, celebrated from her first breath. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday morning while Emily was feeding Grace in the kitchen, the spring sunlight creating patterns across the hardwood floors that made the house feel like something from a magazine about family happiness. Emily wasn't expecting visitors. Her new life was still small and carefully constructed, built around people who'd proven their reliability rather than those who might bring drama or judgment. Through the front window, she could see her mother standing on the porch holding a small gift bag and wearing the nervous expression of someone who'd rehearsed a conversation but wasn't confident about the outcome. Emily's first instinct was to ignore the doorbell, to let her mother stand there until she gave up and went home to explain to Emily's father that their daughter was still too stubborn and ungrateful to accept their attempts at reconciliation. But something about her mother's posture, smaller somehow, less certain than Emily remembered, made her curious about what had prompted this visit. She settled Grace in her carrier and opened the door with the cautious manner of someone who'd learned not to trust family members' motivations without clear evidence of their intentions. "Emily," her mother said, her voice carrying none of the cold authority that had characterized their last conversation. "I know I don't have the right to be here, but I was hoping we could talk." "About what?" Emily asked, not inviting her mother inside but not closing the door either. She wanted to understand what had changed, what had made the woman who'd chosen social reputation over her daughter's welfare suddenly interested in rebuilding their relationship. Her mother's eyes moved to the baby carrier, and Emily watched her face transform with the particular softness that grandparents experienced when seeing their grandchildren for the first time. But Emily felt no urge to facilitate that connection, understanding that being related to Grace didn't automatically grant anyone rights to her attention or affection. "She's beautiful," her mother whispered, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "She looks like you did when you were born." Same nose, same way of sleeping with her hands near her face. "Her name is Grace," Emily said simply, offering the information without invitation to deeper connection. "She was born 3 weeks ago." The pain that crossed her mother's face was immediate and devastating. The realization that she'd missed her granddaughter's birth, that Emily had navigated pregnancy, labor, and early motherhood without any support from the people who should have been most involved in celebrating new life in their family. "Emily, I made a terrible mistake," her mother said, her voice breaking with the weight of admissions that had clearly taken months to acknowledge. "Your father and we were so concerned about what other people would think that we forgot what was actually important. We forgot that you're our daughter, and that baby is our granddaughter, and that nothing else should have mattered." Emily listened without responding, holding space for her mother's apology, while protecting herself from the hope that this conversation might lead to genuine reconciliation. She'd learned that people could feel remorse about their actions without actually changing their fundamental character, that apologies sometimes served the apologizer's need for forgiveness more than the victim's need for justice. "How did you find me?" Emily asked, genuinely curious about what had led her mother to this specific address when Emily had been careful not to share information about her changed circumstances with anyone connected to her previous life. "Janet at the bookstore," her mother admitted, looking embarrassed. "I went there hoping she might know something about where you were living, whether you were safe. She wouldn't tell me your address, but she said you were doing well, that you'd found some kind of support system. She said you'd had the baby and that both of you were healthy and happy." Emily appreciated Janet's discretion, sharing enough information to reassure a worried family member without betraying confidences or providing details that could be used to intrude on her privacy. It demonstrated the kind of thoughtful kindness that Emily had learned to value above biological connections, that came with expectations and obligations. "I also heard about your grandmother's death," her mother continued, her voice becoming smaller. "I know we weren't speaking to her, but I remembered how much she loved you when you were little before the arguments started. I wondered if she might have left you something, some way to take care of yourself and the baby." Emily realized that her mother had no idea about the extent of the inheritance, probably assuming that her grandmother had left behind modest savings or family jewelry rather than millions of dollars and a house in one of Chicago's most desirable neighborhoods. The assumption revealed how little her parents understood about the woman they'd cut out of their lives, how completely they'd dismissed someone whose love had proven more reliable than their own. "She did," Emily said simply, not elaborating on the details, but wanting her mother to understand that Grace's security didn't depend on renewed family relationships or reluctant grandparental support. "I want to make things right," her mother said, extending the gift bag with the tentative gesture of someone who wasn't certain her offering would be accepted. "I know we can't undo what we did, but maybe we could start over somehow. Maybe we could be the kind of family that Grace deserves to grow up with." Emily took the bag but didn't open it, understanding that this moment required careful consideration rather than immediate emotional response. Inside was a hand-knitted baby blanket in soft yellow yarn, obviously made with care and attention over many hours of work. Her mother had been preparing for this reconciliation attempt for months, creating something beautiful while building courage to ask for forgiveness. "Grace already has family," Emily said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "She has people who chose to love and support us when we needed it most. She has Michael, who offered us safety when we had nowhere to go. She has Margaret, who taught me that dignity doesn't depend on other people's approval. She has Janet, who believed in my worth when my own family couldn't see it." Her mother's face crumpled with the devastating realization that her absence had been filled by other people, that Emily had created a chosen family that functioned better than the biological one she'd been born into. "I understand," her mother whispered. "I understand that we lost the right to be part of your lives. But maybe someday when Grace is older and you've had time to heal from what we did, maybe there could be space for us to try again." Emily looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully despite the emotional conversation happening around her, and felt a profound sense of protection for this innocent life that would never experience the conditional love that had shaped Emily's own childhood. Grace would grow up knowing that love was dependable, that family was defined by commitment rather than biology, that her worth wasn't contingent on meeting other people's expectations. "Maybe," Emily said finally, not committing to anything but not closing the door completely either. "But it would have to be different. It would have to be about Grace's well-being, not your comfort. It would have to be earned rather than expected." Her mother nodded through her tears, understanding that this conversation was ending rather than beginning, that Emily was offering possibility rather than immediate forgiveness. As she walked back to her car, Emily watched from the window, holding Grace closer and whispering promises about the life they would build together, a life founded on chosen love rather than obligated tolerance, on security rather than uncertainty, on the kind of unconditional acceptance that Emily had finally learned to give herself. 6 months later, Emily stood in the same community center where she'd first found refuge, announcing the establishment of the Margaret O'Brien Foundation for Women in Crisis, a program that would provide housing, job training, and childcare support for women facing circumstances similar to what she'd experienced. In the audience sat the people who'd become her real family, applauding not just her success, but her choice to transform personal pain into collective healing. Have you ever experienced or known someone who went through something similar? If this story touched you, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps spread this message. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.